Hello everyone, my name is Cico and I'm going to present a paper titled Towards Transferring Lean Startup Practices to Software Engineering Education. This is part of my PhD project and the event is the ESEC FSE 2020 Doctoral Symposium. I am a PhD candidate at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. So let me go briefly through the outline of this paper. I will start with the introduction by stating research motivation, aims, and objectives that I have for this research. And then I'll continue with the research context, scope, background, and expected contributions. Furthermore, I will state the research questions for my PhD and the methodology I've used in order to achieve the answering of those particular research questions. And finally, I will present the results obtained in the first 2 years and continue further by stating future plans until completion. And I will conclude the presentation with research evaluation, dissemination, and ethics. So let me go through the research motivation, aim, and objectives. By starting with the motivation, Lean Startup is an emerging trend in the industry over the past decade. And obviously, Lean Startup is also a trend which is underrepresented in software engineering education. And there are several difficulties that we are presently facing in order to foster Lean Startup within SIE in particular. First is the adoption of innovative software engineering practices in general in software engineering education, and fostering startup formation and innovation mindset among software engineering students. Furthermore, inclusion of external activities such as hackathon, boot camps, and innovation workshops into the software engineering education courses is still in its infant state. My primary aim is to contribute to the ever-evolving development of industry-relevant teaching strategies, and specifically based on Lean Startup. The research objectives of my thesis are: the first one is to identify the extent to which Lean Startup practices are present in industry and academia based on software engineering trends. Second, identify the growth phase Lean Startup software practices potentially transferable to education. And third, evaluate how Lean Startup focused external activities affect student skills and startup formation mindset in software engineering education, experience-based courses. And finally, propose a model and framework that facilitates the Lean Startup practice transfer to the software engineering education context. So let me go through the research context and the scope within. So this is the outcome of our research context. And the scope and limitations that we are addressing is, first, I am looking into the exploring to Lean Startup software engineering practice transfer to software engineering courses involving external stakeholders and experience-based learning, like for instance, the course called Experts in Teamwork. And second, what is important is that there are some limitations. We are still looking at courses which are project-based learning, for instance, customer-driven, or courses that are oriented mainly on software engineering practices. But we are not looking at software engineering courses that are not part of our scope, for instance, courses that are in bachelor studies or that have little to no approach to project-based learning. And second, the other important scope is to explore software engineering practices in growth phase startups, which in particular, we are looking at early stage software startups that are out of the scope of our research, but I am mainly looking in growth phase startups. And extensively studied, since early phase startups are extensively studied in the context of software engineering practices from earlier researchers. And the research background is stemming from different research efforts made from several authors, and all these authors have made their own approach in introducing Lean Startup within the education context. Like for instance, Ph.D. and Davis and Bullen utilize students for entrepreneurship courses as customers, for instance. while Chenin et al., they combine challenge-based learning with lean startup and customer development. And Fagerholm introduces the project-based startup education in software engineering context. And how they do this is throughout the software factory as an educational environment for experiential project-based learning. So what do we do differently from previous efforts is that we introduce external bootcamp activity and focus the course around that particular activity. So let me go through the expected contributions for this work. First, I would like to update existing software engineering teaching and learning approaches. And second, fill the gap between industry and academia by introducing, for instance, external activities within the course, which involve stakeholders from academic context and from industry context. And third, I would like to contribute to a software startup body of knowledge by gathering further evidence about growth phase startups and how they tackle the software engineering practices. So what are the research questions that I have used in order to explore this PhD work? First is the research question number 1. To what extent are software engineering trends presented in software engineering education research? And this research question is based on primarily 3 more sub-questions. The first one explores industry models, processes, and methods that are embraced in software engineering education research. And then industry-relevant teaching approaches presented also in software engineering education research. And finally, the stakeholders that have worked together according to the research at hand. The second research question is oriented towards what do we know about lean startup practices from an industry context. And then 2 more research sub-questions address the main research question 2, where I state what are the discrepancies in software practices when lean startups actually shift from early to growth phase. And second, which lean startup software practices can be or might be transferable to software engineering education. And finally, the research question 3 is more oriented towards the impact of lean startup practices on software engineering students and curricula. So how I address this is throughout 3 more sub-questions where I state how do lean startup focused external activities affect students' learning in experience-based courses? And also, how do external activities affect students' motivation towards startup formation within the software engineering education curricula? And finally, what model and framework can facilitate lean startup practices transfer within the software engineering education curricula? The methodology I've used in order to address and answer the 3 research questions is as follows. So I will state the methodology steps, the method I've used, and the outcomes obtained for each step, connected as well to the answering of the particular research questions. So the step 1 is to identify lean startup as part of software engineering education trends within the software engineering education research. So in order to do so, I have conducted a systematic mapping study, which led towards answering the research question 1 and its particular sub-questions. And what the mapping study showed was the following, and the context was to look into industry trends and software engineering education trends and find out what is the intersection between them, and also identify which software industry and education common teaching practices or models and processes that have been used, as well as which stakeholders have been involved into this kind of software engineering approaches represented in the education context. And then the idea is to find a research gap. So what has happened, I have looked into 126 roughly sources and coming from education and looking at stakeholders that might have been from education and industry, and perform color coding and synthesis of each paper throughout extracting the data in a mapping representation. I'll talk more about the results further on. But step 2 is about to identify software engineering practices in growth phase startups transferable to software engineering education. And in order to address this second step, I've used mixed method approach. And the idea is to answer the research question number 2 and consequent sub-questions. And in particular, how this study was conducted was to look at startups in general, and in particular lean startups, and then even at a more stringent way to the growth phase startups, lean growth phase startups, let's say in different words. The instruments I used in order to explore their particular software engineering practices are interviews and questionnaires, with the lenses towards looking at which practices can be transferred to the education context. And this will be an iterative process because I will look several times in order to identify the practices and update potentially what can be transferred to the education context in particular. And finally, step number 3 involves develop a theoretical model and framework which will enable lean startup practices transferred to the software engineering education curricula. And in order to do so, I've used design-based research, which leads to answering the research question 3. And in particular, what I've done with design-based research is to... So the methodology, if we look at it in certain perspectives, it is starting from a very broad perspective at the beginning, but it then moves towards a more focused one. And what we are trying to do here is to, in the first 2 steps, is to have sort of a support for our research, main research, which is the step number 3. And since the step number 3 is our main investigation, then we'll spend more effort. I'll spend more effort into providing evidence for designing a model and a framework that can be valid based on empirical data. Through the results that have been obtained during the first 2 years and what are afterwards the future plans until the completion of this PhD. From the mapping study conducted at the very first step, I have been able to identify lean startup as part of the software engineering trends, where I have analyzed in total 126 studies, out of which 12 were from lean startup studies. And this was sort of equal to the global software engineering trend. And I would say that this is a lean startup together with global software engineering, but I'm more interested in lean startup studies. It's coming as a second trend after Agile. And we have to agree here that Agile is quite broad and it has been extensively researched during the past decades. So to move further on, the results of the systematic mapping study have been published in the conference, first at ESEC as a poster paper, but then it was been published to a very highly qualitative journal, namely the Journal of Systems and Software. And this is extensive work where I have presented the whole study design and the mapping study in its full context and outcomes and the achievements. And with this step, with this methodology step, I have actually obtained or achieved my first research objective by answering the first research question and corresponding sub-questions. To move on, I have looked into software engineering practices, findings in growth phase startups in US, Norway, and Brazil. And the investigations are from growth phase startups, software engineering practices, for instance. We have gathered patterns and anti-patterns for those practices. And then we have also looked, I have also looked into technical depth perception from the different stakeholders or from different startup practitioners in particular. I'm not going to discuss in detail the results, but these results have all been published in corresponding venues. And the findings are comparable to practices adopted in software engineering education, but of course tailored more towards startup context. So let me go through where these results have been published presently. The results from step 2 are published in first in SIGSOFT 2019, and then again as a short paper in ESE conference in 2020. And actually the study here, the 2 studies here have been accepted to SIGSOFT recently I've written on the review, but they have been accepted. The second study has been accepted in the first study. Actually, it's been accepted in the ESEC 2020, together with the second one. And methodology step 2 has been achieved, and actually by achieving also the research objective 2 alongside answering the research question 2 and sub-questions. However, I can still iterate over the findings, since I can gather more further evidence in order to bring more context to what could be further software engineering practices that can be transferred to software engineering education. And to move on, investigation within startup-driven experts in teamwork course has been conducted in spring 2019. And this was the first iteration where I gathered quantitative results from students actually about technical, project management, and soft skills before and after the bootcamp settings. And what is interesting here is that we see the discrepancies and the variances of those perceptions alongside perceptions towards interest in startup formation and involving existing team members. And I've also gathered, since the approach here is mixed method approach, I've also gathered qualitative evidence, which results into providing further insights on what are the student perceptions and thematic analysis of those perceptions. And again, this has been repeated in 2020, where I gather quantitative results again from students by analyzing the same dimensions. However, what I'm doing here, like analyzing technical, project management, soft skills, startup formation, and involving different team members, but I also compare data now from 2 years. And again, this goes along with the qualitative data gathered and results, which are actually stating again what are the perceptions of the students about the challenges and their motivations. So let me move further on. What are the key takeaways from this research that has been conducted in the first 2 years? First, technical skills, there is no significant impact from the bootcamp activity. However, soft skills, we observed that they are bolstered from the bootcamp and from the collaboration with the stakeholders. Same applies to project management skills, where students learn a lot from utilizing agile and lean approaches. And furthermore, startup formation motivation is increased by the end of the course, usually, after the students have participated in all these activities that we present to them, and close collaboration with the stakeholders. And finally, involvement of existing team members in startup formation is perceived as positive in most cases. However, students still agree that they can involve other members in the team from people they know from before, or collaborators and so on, other collaborators. So how this model artifact has evolved from 2 iterations. First, we have a very simplified version of our model, which after collecting further data in the second year, we derive a little bit more detailed version of the model. And of course, this will be improved if we have a third and fourth iteration in order to tackle the different aspects of the model. And when it comes to publications, again, I have published the results in different venues, like such as EduCon EXOB in 2019, and then EduCon in 2020, about student skills perception and their startup formation motivation. And again, there is a publication from iteration number 2 at Frontiers in Education, which has recently, the proceedings is not yet available, but it has been recently presented at the conference. And the methodology step 3, together with research objective 3 and 4, as well as research question and sub-question, research question 3 and sub-questions have again been partially answered, because still more iterations can be performed. The second version of the model needs to be published and presented into as an article or as a conference paper. But what's important is that I need still to go through the next step to improve this step furthermore, because this represents the main part of my study, what has been going on with efforts and some magazine articles which present the overall efforts made in the last 2 years. Thank you very much, and if you have questions, please feel free to make them and I'll be happy to answer.